The Death of the West: How Dying Populations and Immigrant Invasions Imperil Our Country and Civilization, by Patrick J. Buchanan. Chapter 7: The War Against the Past. To destroy a people, you must first sever their roots. Alexander Solzhenitsyn. How does one sever a people's roots? Answer: destroy its memory. Deny a people the knowledge of who they are and where they came from. If we forget what we did, we won't know who we are, said Ronald Reagan in his farewell address to the American people. I am warning of the eradication of the American memory that could result, ultimately, in an erosion of the American spirit. In the Middle Ages, Ottoman Turks imposed on Balkan Christians a blood tax. 1 boy out of every 5. Taken from their parents, the boys were raised as strict Muslims to become the fanatic elite soldiers of the Sultan, the Janissaries, who were then sent back to occupy and oppress the peoples who had borne them. For a modern state, the formula for erasing memory was given to us by Orwell in the party slogan of Big Brother: Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. Destroy the record of a people's past. Leave it in ignorance of who its ancestors were and what they did, and one can fill the empty vessels of their souls with a new history, as in 1984. Dishonor or disgrace a nation's heroes, and you can demoralize its people. The cause of Irish independence was crippled by the revelation that the great Charles Stewart Parnell was living in adultery with the wife of Captain O'Shea. Baseball almost did not survive the Black Sox scandal of 1919, when popular hero Shoeless Joe Jackson was found to have taken money from gamblers and his team had thrown the World Series. The loss of faith was caught in the kid's lament, "Say it ain't so, Joe." Richard Nixon's new majority was shattered by Watergate and the resignation of a president and vice president who had carried 49 states. The success of Nixon's enemies in ousting from office a hated adversary became the archetype for the politics of personal destruction, the defeat of causes by disgracing their flawed champions. It has become standard operating procedure in American politics. Cultural Marxists understood this. Their critical theory was a prototype of the politics of personal destruction. What the latter does to popular leaders, critical theory does to an entire nation through repeated assaults on its past. It is the moral equivalent of vandalizing the graves and desecrating the corpses of its ancestors. Many of the institutions that now have custody of America's past operate on the principles of Big Brother's Ministry of Truth. Drop down the memory hole the patriotic stories of America's greatness and glory, and produce new warts and all histories that play up her crimes and sins, revealing what we have loved to be loathsome, and those we have revered to be disreputable, even despicable. Many old heroes have not survived the killing fields of the new history. Ultimate goal: destroy patriotism, kill the love of country, demoralize the people, deconstruct America. History then will no longer unite and inspire us, but depress and divide us into the children of victims and the children of the villains of America's past. A child's love of its mother grows naturally, but love of country must be taught. Only by learning can a child know of the people and nation to which he or she belongs. For those born before World War II, love of country came easily. Radio, movies, newspapers, comic books, and conversations conveyed the same message. We were a good and trusting people, attacked without warning at Pearl Harbor. Many brave Americans had died there. Others were bayoneted on a death march in a place called Buchanan. Now we were paying Japan back. There was a spirit of solidarity and unity than unlike any we have known since. We were truly one nation, indivisible, and one people. But the war was not unquestioned. Nightly, one heard arguments over the blackout, whether the Germans could bomb Washington, the wisdom of aiding Stalin, the merits of Eisenhower versus those of MacArthur, the sellout of Poland, and who was responsible for our being caught unprepared at Pearl Harbor. Today, the good war is among the few events in history that retains its luster, still a bright, shining moment. Whatever the wisdom of the decisions, our enemies were the incarnation of evil, and we were on God's side. Korea was different, a divisive war in a divided nation, Truman's America. But, unlike Vietnam, no patriot suggested that the North Koreans or Chinese communists were right and America was wrong. The dissent was General Bradley's dissent. Korea was the wrong war, in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong enemy. With Eisenhower came an end to Korea and the savage arguments over the sellout of Yalta and who lost China, and the beginning of a new era of good feelings, which lasted until November 22nd, 1963. But after the assassination of President Kennedy, an adversary culture arose that set about dynamiting America's legends, demythologizing her history, and demolishing her heroes. With its media collaborators, this counterculture has left scarcely an institution unscarred, or a hero unsullied. We grew up in an era of belief. We grew old in an era of disbelief, feebly fending off the relentless pounding of the artillery of an adversary culture that accepts no armistice. The old history. Not long ago, every American child knew the names of all the great explorers: Magellan, da Gama, de Soto, Cortes, Henry Hudson. But the greatest of all was Columbus, for he had discovered America in one of the greatest events of world history. Our history books began here. In the Catholic schools, stories of the French and Spanish explorers and of the North American martyrs like Father Isaac Jogues, the apostle to the Iroquois tomahawked to death near Albany, were assented. But we too got around to John Smith and Jamestown and the Pilgrims and Plymouth Rock. From there, our histories leapt 150 years to the French and Indian War, the Stamp Act, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death, Bunker Hill, the Declaration of Independence, Valley Forge, I Regret That I Have But One Life to Give for My Country, Benedict Arnold, Saratoga, and Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown. From triumph to triumph, American history marched. The British burned the White House, but Dolly Madison saved the paintings. Our men held through the night of the bombardment of Fort McHenry, and Andy Jackson paid the British back at New Orleans. The Alamo came quickly, where Crockett and the Texas heroes refused to surrender and died to a man on Mexican bayonets. No one suggested America stole anything. After the Alamo, the Mexicans had it coming. In the 1950s, a Davy Crockett craze swept America, with a movie, a TV show, and even a best-selling record about the king of the wild frontier. Davy made actor Fess Parker famous. There were so many kids walking around in coonskin caps that the raccoon population took a serious hit. Rock star Johnny Horton recorded Jimmy Driftwood's Battle of New Orleans. In 1814, we took a little trip, along with Colonel Jackson down the mighty Mississippi, and we took a little bacon, and we took a little beans, and we caught the bloody British in a town called New Orleans. In our Civil War histories, Lee and Jackson were great soldiers and men of nobility. Sherman's march to the sea was a black page in history. Reconstruction was cruel. Southerners were, after all, fellow Americans who had fought bravely and should have been treated with honor. Dixie was more popular than the battle hymn of the Republic. But Lincoln was the great hero, with a holiday in his honor. He had saved the Union and freed the slaves, only to be assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in one of the great tragedies of American history. For Honest Abe would never have allowed Reconstruction, so we were taught. After the Civil War came the winning of the West. Pioneers, men, women, and children alike crossed the Great Plains, braving the terrible weather and constant threat of Indian massacres. General Custer and the 7th Cavalry were historic in our history books. They died with their boots on, starring Errol Flynn and Ronald Reagan told us so. This was also the time of the robber barons, who had grabbed the railroads and banks until they met their match in the great trust buster Teddy Roosevelt. The hero of San Juan Hill also built the Panama Canal, a marvel of American engineering genius. Those were the days of Edison, the Wright brothers, and Alexander Graham Bell, when we Americans had invented pretty much everything worth inventing. Then came World War I, when President Wilson sent our soldiers off to make the world safe for democracy. Led by General Pershing, with Sergeant York as the hero of the war, we defeated Germany, which had started the war by torpedoing our ships. Soon after, Japan treacherously attacked us at Pearl Harbor, so we had to go back again and finish the job, destroying Mussolini and Hitler, although in Catholic schools Stalin was every bit as monstrous. There was no popular front at the Blessed Sacrament school the author attended. Now we had to save the world from atheistic communism. At the end of the daily Mass, we recited a prayer for the conversion of Russia, later dropped for the more dentist prayer for peace. Now, the above is not a nuanced rendering of American history, yet at its core is this truth. We Americans have a glorious history, the richest and greatest of any modern people or nation, or of any republic that went before us. Were wrongs committed and crimes covered up? Surely. That is true of every nation. But none had triumphed in as many endeavors as America had, and there is no need for 8-year-olds to debate Fort Pillow or the trysts of Warren Harding or John F. Kennedy. We established public schools in America to create good citizens and patriots who will protect and preserve their country. These schools should lead children through courses that will teach them to love America. As a child reads the biographies, histories, stories, and poems, and hears the stories and sees the paintings that tell of a glorious national past, patriotism takes root. With a growing love of country comes a growing desire to be forever a part of this people, and a willingness to sacrifice, even to die, to defend this people, as one would defend one's family. In the New Testament, Christ holds out a hellish punishment for any who would destroy the belief of these little ones. It were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck, and that he were drowned in the depths of the sea. Yet, American children are today being robbed of their heritage, cheated of their right to know the magnificent history of their country. In The Disuniting of America, Arthur Schlesinger cites a character out of Milan Kundera's The Book of Laughter and Forgetting. The first step in liquidating a people is to erase its memory, destroy its books, its culture, its history. Then have someone write new books, manufacture a new culture, invent a new history. Before long, the nation will begin to forget what it is and what it was. Another character adds, the struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. This is the struggle of the old America against the Cultural Revolution. Yet, look at what our Ministry of Truth has already done to our heroes and our history. Goodbye, Columbus. On the 300th anniversary of Columbus's voyage, 1792, New York's King's College was renamed Columbia, and the U.S. Capitol was named the District of Columbia. In 1882, to honor a prophet, an instrument of divine providence, Irish Catholics organized the Knights of Columbus. The Admiral of the Ocean Sea was the Columbus we grew up with, but, As columnist Gary Willis chortled in the New York Review of Books, a funny thing happened on the way to the quintessential observation of America's discovery. Columbus got mugged. This time the Indians were waiting for him. He comes now with an apologetic air, but not for some sufficiently apologetic. He comes to be dishonored. Kirkpatrick Sale's Conquest of Paradise and Jan Carew's Columbus, The Rape of Paradise, accused the explorer of having introduced slavery to the West and set off a legacy of shame and racism that continues to this day. The UN canceled its Columbus celebration, and the National Council of Churches urged that the 500th anniversary of his voyage be set aside as a time for penitence for the genocide, slavery, ecocide, and exploitation the Italian explorer introduced to the Americas. Writes columnist George Samueli of the New York Press. In 1992, the quincentenary of Christopher Columbus's transatlantic journey came and went with scarcely any national celebration. Only rote condemnation of the cruelty, greed, and savagery of the continent's European conquerors punctured the embarrassed national silence. When Italian Americans sought to carry a banner of Columbus in their October 2000 parade in Denver, radicals of the American Indian movement threatened violence. AIM's veteran troublemaker, Russell Means, said that Columbus makes Hitler look like a juvenile delinquent. Marching in step with the forces of progress, the University of California at Berkeley hastily changed Columbus Day into Indigenous Peoples Day. The diabolization of the great Spanish explorers and conquistadors as irredeemable racist murderers is almost complete. America, it is said, was not discovered, but invaded by disease-ridden Europeans who burned out native cultures as they razed native villages. Cortez's burning of his ships and march inland with a handful of soldiers to conquer and convert the Aztecs is now cultural genocide against a peace-loving people. That the Aztecs were themselves conquerors who made slaves of defeated enemies and offered human blood sacrifices to Huitzilopochtli, their god of sun and war, is ignored. And what is meant by cultural genocide? When the Europeans arrived in the Americas, some indigenous tribes were still practicing cannibalism, and not one had invented the wheel. The Founding Fathers. Now comes the turn of the Founding Fathers. 5 of our first 7 presidents, excepting only the Adamses, owned slaves. Jefferson was a hypocrite, whose all men are created equal clause in the Declaration of Independence is contradicted by his lifelong ownership of slaves. His sexual exploitation of Sally Hemings, whose mulatto children he cowardly refused to recognize, was disgraceful. Washington, too, was a slave owner and a participant in the greatest evil in U.S. history. Madison was yet another. The abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison was right to call the Constitution Madison wrote an agreement with death and a covenant with hell. By the corrupt bargain that sealed the success of that constitutional convention, slaves counted as only 3/5 of a person. As for Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory was, in the judgment of commentator-author Robert Novak, a murderer, a demagogue, a brute, a racist, and corrupt to boot, and guilty of genocidal massacres in his Indian wars. How successful has our Ministry of Truth been in shaping the views of Americans towards their country's past? When our parents were young, 89% of American men and 94% of American women thought this was the greatest country on earth. Today, only 58% of American men identify the United States as the best country in the world, and only 51% of American women agree. Dr. David Yeagley, a columnist with Front Page magazine, tells a story of how the new anti-history is killing love of country in the souls of the young. Himself a descendant of Comanches, Yeagley was leading his class in social psychology at Oklahoma State in a spirited discussion of patriotism and what it means to be an American, when a beautiful young white girl jolted the class with these remarks. "Look, Dr. Yeagley, I don't see anything about my culture to be proud of. It's all nothing. My race is just nothing. Look at your culture. Look at American Indian tradition. Now I think that's really great. You have something to be proud of. My culture is nothing. I'm not proud of how America came about." "On one level I wasn't surprised," said Dr. Yeagley. "I knew the head of our American History Department at Oklahoma State, and I recognized his hackneyed liberal jargon. She had taken one of his courses with predictable results. Still, Yeagley was stunned by the timidity and silence of the rest of the class, as this woman denounced her own people and nation as well as theirs. No Indian woman would have dared say such a thing in the presence of Indian men. The rewrite men of America's past have done their work well. Consider the reaction to one of the most popular movies of 2000, The Patriot. The film stars Mel Gibson as Benjamin Martin, an American hero of the French and Indian War, and a father of 7 who wants to stay out of the Revolution. Martin is drawn into the fighting when his teenage son is murdered before his eyes by a brutal British officer, and his eldest boy, a rebel, is taken away to be executed. The story is set in South Carolina, and Martin is based on Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, and Daniel Morgan, the famed guerrilla. The British antagonist is based upon the legendarily ruthless Colonel Benestra Tarleton. Two powerful and memorable scenes enraged critics. The first is when Martin, having witnessed his son's cold-blooded killing, instructs his 2 younger boys, aged 13 and 10, to grab muskets and follow him. They ambush the British patrol, which is shot to pieces, with Martin finishing the last British soldier off with his hatchet. Father and sons have avenged an atrocity and rescued a son and brother about to be lynched. The second scene has the British officer taking his revenge. Corralling dozens of civilians from Martin's village in a church, he orders the doors locked and the church burned. On seeing Patriot, some movie reviewers went more berserk than Martin had on seeing his son executed. "Don't mistake The Patriot for history," wrote James Vanier in the Boston Herald. "It's a sales pitch for America." And what would be wrong with that? "Overblown sanctimony and sentimentalism," wrote Ann Hornaday in the Baltimore Sun. "As corny as the 4th of July. Indeed, much more dishonest and damaging than anything that sprung from Oliver Stone's imagination." But damaging to whom? Stone had implied that the CIA, the U.S. military, and Lyndon Johnson conspired in the murder of John F. Kennedy. Film director Spike Lee emerged from the movie apoplectic, choking with rage. His letter to the Hollywood Reporter deserves quotation at length, for it mirrors the mindset of our new cultural elite. "I, along with millions of other Americans, went to see The Patriot. We both came out of the theater fuming. The Patriot is pure, blatant propaganda, a complete whitewashing of history, revisionist history. For almost 3 hours, The Patriot dodged around, skirted about, or completely ignored slavery. America was built upon the genocide of Native Americans and the enslavement of African people. To say otherwise is criminal." In his enraged epistle, Lee confessed that he had to hold himself back from shouting at the screen. He attacked screenwriter Robert Rodat for not making the Gibson character a slave owner, and not putting at least some Indians into the Revolutionary War film. Where were they? Did the 2 Johns, Ford and Wayne, whip them out already? Incensed by the final scene in which Benjamin Martin holds aloft a 13-star American flag and heroically charges the British lines, Lee castigated it as laughable. What comes out of Lee's letter is virulent anti-Americanism, i.e., our country was built on genocide and enslavement, and his settled conviction that anyone who rejects this view of U.S. history is criminal. Only a sick or criminal mind, Lee is saying, could paint the American Revolution as heroic, honorable, and moral, and not deal with slaughtered Indians. And to portray any blacks in America as free, happy, or loyal is propaganda, an outrage. It cannot be true. In Salon.com, Jonathan Foreman explores for the roots of this evil film and finds them where you might expect. The savage soldiers in the Patriot act more like the Waffen SS than actual English troops. Does the Patriot have an ulterior motive? You could actually argue that The Patriot is as fascist a film, and I use the term in its literal sense, not as a synonym for bad, as anything made in decades. The Patriot presents a deeply sentimental cult of the family, as it casts unusually Aryan-looking heroes. In one scene, two-headed preteens are armed by their father and turned into the equivalent of the werewolf boy soldiers that the Third Reich was thought to have recruited for the Hitler Youth to carry out guerrilla attacks against the invading Allies. In the film's most exciting sequence, Gibson is provoked by the foreigner into becoming one of those bloodiest, axe-wielding forest supermen so beloved in Nazi folk iconography. The black population of South Carolina, where the film is set, is basically depicted as happy, loyal slaves or equally happy and unlikely freemen. The church burning, writes Foreman, replicates the Nazi atrocity in the French village of Oradour-sur-Glane in June 1944. German director Ronald Emmerich may just have a subconscious agenda. By shifting Oradour to South Carolina, he and screenwriter Robert Rodant have done something unpleasantly akin to Holocaust revisionism. They have made a film that will have the effect of inoculating audiences against the unique historical horror of Oradour, implicitly rehabilitating the Nazis. This is the type of film, wrote Foreman, that Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels used in efforts at inflaming isolationist Anglophobia. Lighten up, man, one is tempted to say. Unfortunately, at work here is a mind deeply conditioned and steeped in anti-history. An affecting portrayal of a father and 7 loving and dutiful children represents the cult of the family. Their heroic fight together to overthrow British rule and win America's freedom is fascist. Martin's 13 and 10-year-old sons are like werewolf boy soldiers of the Reich, because they are tow-headed and Aryan-looking. To Foreman, the fascists are everywhere. No more than Spike Lee can Foreman tolerate a depiction of slaves or freedmen as proud American soldiers and patriots. Yet, this is but a cinematic portrayal of a forgotten slice of our history. Free Negroes did soldier and fight in the Revolution, under Jackson at New Orleans and for the Union, and for the Confederacy under Bedford Forrest. The over-the-top reaction to Gibson's Patriot testifies to how our cultural elites have indoctrinated our newest tribe of scribblers in an almost reflexive hatred of America's past and of the men we once revered as patriot fathers. To our new cultural elite, America's Civil War was a revolt of slave owners and traitors to destroy the Union, to preserve their odious institution, and the lost cause was ignoble and dishonorable. Hence, the Confederate flag should be as repulsive as a Nazi swastika, and only white racists and the morally obtuse would defend that bloody banner. As for Lee and Jackson, they led hundreds of thousands to their deaths in an evil cause, and if the NAACP demands we rid the public square of all plaques, statues, or flags of the Confederacy, they are not only within their rights, they are morally right. Not long ago, Stories of the pioneers, soldiers, settlers, and cowboys who won the West and tamed a continent in an historic struggle against an unforgiving nature, outlaws, and Indians were the stuff of books, films, and TV shows that enthralled not only Americans, but the rest of the world as well. But the revisionists have done their work. No film today would dare paint Indians as backward, capricious, or cruel. Rather, as in Little Big Man and Dances with Wolves, Indians are seen as early environmentalists who cherished, nurtured, and protected the land and wildlife they depended on. These peaceful, trusting people were cheated, murdered, and massacred by amoral white men who butchered their way across the plains, slaughtering the buffalo and corrupting the Indians they did not wantonly kill. Custer and the 7th Cavalry are now the role models for the Einstein-Gruppen. Only yesterday. To see how America's heroes of old have been cast out of the pantheon by the Taliban of modernity, consider Washington's birthday, once a national holiday for the father of our country, a soldier and statesman without equal in American history, greatest man of the 18th century, has been replaced by President's Day, when we can all recall the greatness of Millard Fillmore, Chester Arthur, and William Jefferson Clinton. The New Orleans School Board has taken Washington's name off an elementary school. Its new policy prohibits honoring former slave owners or others who did not respect opportunity for all. That rules out Presidents Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Jackson, Tyler, Taylor, and Grant, as well as Clay, Calhoun, and Robert E. Lee. Should African Americans, tens of thousands of whom carry these great names, go to court to get them changed? Is it Andrew Jackson, the Indian killer, or Stonewall Jackson, the Confederate legend, whose name Jesse Jackson proudly carries? Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, was last year declared persona non grata in New Jersey. The legislature twice defeated a bill that would have required public school students to recite in class each day a brief passage from the Declaration. Every Democrat in the State House voted no on the Declaration, which was denounced as anti-women, anti-black, and too pro-God. State Senator Wayne Bryant, an African American, led the fight to spare students from the indignity of having to recite Jefferson's "All men are created equal." Bryant berated the bill's sponsor. "You have nerve to ask my grandchildren to recite the Declaration. How dare you? You are now on notice that this is offensive to my community." Andrew Jackson, who seized Florida from Spain for the United States, is the target of an American Indian movement campaign. Calling Jackson a genocidal maniac who served as a Hitler prototype, AIM wants to prevent America's 7th president from being honored in the annual springtime Tallahassee parade. Old Hickory has trouble in North Carolina, too. There, a self-described vice chief of the Tuscaroras, Robert Chavis, wants US 74, now Andrew Jackson Highway, to be renamed American Indian Highway. Andrew Jackson is no hero to us. He's like Hitler. He's a killer, says Chavis, who claims to have 4,000 signatures on a petition to effect the name change. As the face of the US $20 bill is now graced by a portrait of King Andrew, who was a slave owner, an Indian fighter, and the president who signed the law that moved the Cherokees out of Georgia and the Carolinas to Oklahoma, this could get interesting. Custer National Battlefield has lately been renamed Little Bighorn National Battlefield, as the Indians consider the massacre of Custer's entire command a great victory. Alongside the small obelisk that now honors the American dead at the 7th Cavalry, will rise a monument to the Indians who killed and scalped them and mutilated their bodies. Militant Indians have demanded that all sports teams drop Indian names. In 2001, the U.S. Civil Rights Commission agreed. arguing that the collegiate use of Indian team names and mascots is disrespectful and offensive, and creates a racially hostile educational environment. We were not told when exactly it became so, but with political correctness now the prevailing orthodoxy on campuses, the campaign is succeeding. The Dartmouth Indians are now Big Green, the Stanford Indians are now Cardinals, and St. John's University's Redmen are now the Red Storm. North Dakota, however, decided to retain Fighting Sioux, after an alumnus threatened to withdraw his $100 million pledge if the name was changed. The Washington Redskins and Atlanta Braves have also balked, as Braves fans continue to use their famed tomahawk chop, though it is said to be insulting to the inventors of the tomahawk. The Portland Oregonian has adopted a policy of refusing to mention team names that include the words Indians, Braves, Redmen, Redskins, or Chiefs. In San Jose, California, Indian and Hispanic rage prevented a statue of Thomas Fallon, the American adventurer who captured the town in the Mexican War and became its mayor, from being placed in a public park. The statue is an insult to our ancestors, people who were lynched here, said Pascual Mendeville of Pueblo Unido. It's like a red flag to racists out there that it's open season on Mexicans. San Jose, however, does boast a new statue of Quetzalcoatl, a feathered serpent god of the Aztecs, whose empire never came close to reaching San Jose. Perhaps Mexicans and Indians should reconsider Quetzalcoatl. The Aztec emperor Montezuma II was a deeply superstitious fellow, terrified that Quetzalcoatl would return from the east to claim his throne. When his emissaries reported that Cortes and his bearded white men were ashore at Veracruz, the fearless Montezuma and his court went into a panic. In St. Augustine, Florida, oldest city in the United States, founded by Columbus's lieutenant Ponce de Leon, removal of Ponce's bayfront statue is being demanded by American Indians. The Spanish explorer, mortally wounded by an arrow in his search for the Fountain of Youth, is said by the Indians to have been a genocidal maniac. In Southampton, Long Island, the local anti-bias task force is demanding the scrapping of the town's 70-year official seal, a medallion featuring a white man in pilgrim dress and an Indian in a loincloth. The seal reads, "First English Settlement in the State of New York," and has in its background a square rigger and the rock called Conscious Point, where the first colonists from Lynn, Massachusetts, landed in 1640. The seal is on road signs and all town documents. The seal represents one race, one gender, and one part of history, protests Task Force ex-chair Susanna Powell. History did not start in 1640. Native Americans were here long before that. Adds the anti-bias task force chairman Robert Zeller, the seal is inaccurate. They didn't wear loincloths here the year round. It was too cold. Perhaps the seal can be altered to put the Shinnecock Indian into something nice from L.L. Bean. But it is the South and anything associated with the lost cause that is today's inflamed front of the culture war. In 1898, President McKinley, a veteran of Antietam, could go to Atlanta, stand for the plain of Dixie, wave his hat to his old enemies, and recommend the preservation of Confederate graves, a splendid gesture that helped heal a country about to go to war with Spain. Today, McKinley would be charged with giving moral sanction to a racist cause. 100 years after McKinley's Woe Geste, America's cultural elite is almost slavishly on the side of those who wish to dishonor every banner and disgrace every leader associated with the Confederate States of America. In Richmond, which was defended for 4 years by his Army of Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee's portrait was ordered removed from a display of famous Virginians, and the painting was then desecrated by vandals. On Monument Avenue, where statues of the four great sons of the Confederacy stand, Lee, Jackson, Stuart, and Davis, a statue of black tennis star Arthur Ashe stands in their midst, put there to disrupt and contradict the symbolism. Lee Jackson Day has been severed from Martin Luther King Day, and many believe it will soon be terminated in Virginia, where both Confederate heroes lie buried. After a decade-long boycott led by the NAACP, the Confederate battle flag was ordered down from the South Carolina Capitol, which still bears the scars of the shelling by Sherman's army, which burned Columbia to the ground. South Carolinians wanted to keep the flag where it had flown since 1962, after President Eisenhower urged Americans to memorialize the centennial of the war. But what South Carolina wanted did not matter. Conventions were canceled. Entertainers and athletes threatened not to appear in the state. The legislature capitulated, and the flag came down, moved to a battle monument on the Capitol grounds. But that did not satisfy the NAACP. The boycott continues until the flag disappears. Georgia, threatened with a boycott, abolished its state flag, which had a replica of the Confederate battle flag, prompting ex-Atlanta Mayor Maynard Jackson to thank the governor, who fought to get rid of the swastika. In Texas, on the orders of Governor George W. Bush, 2 plaques to Confederate war dead, paid for from a Confederate widows' fund, were removed from the state Supreme Court building. In Florida, on February 2, 2001, Governor Jeb Bush removed the Confederate battle flag from atop the state capitol in Tallahassee, where it had flown since 1978. In Mississippi, students at Ole Miss have been forbidden by court order from waving tiny battle flags in the stadium. Boycotts of the state were threatened if Mississippi's flag was not altered to remove the replica of the battle flag. But when the issue was put to a statewide vote in April 2001, the old flag won by 2-1. It seems that Southern politicians of both parties, to pacify minorities and placate a national cultural elite, are ignoring the will of the people they are elected to represent. In Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, there is a stone memorial to the freeman Hayward Shepherd, the baggage master who was the first man killed in John Brown's terrorist raid on the federal arsenal, which was crushed by Marines led by Brigadier Colonel Robert E. Lee and Lieutenant J. E. B. Stewart. The memorial, near the corner of Potomac and Shenandoah, was put there in 1931 by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. An inscription states that Hayward Shepherd exemplified the character and faithfulness of thousands of Negroes who, under so many temptations throughout subsequent years of war, so conducted themselves that no stain was left upon a record which is the peculiar heritage of the American people and an everlasting tribute to the best of both races. While the stone has been covered for years, repeated efforts to have it removed have thus far failed. At Point Lookout Cemetery in southern Maryland, a Memorial Day tradition of putting tiny Confederate flags on the graves of the 4,000 Southern soldiers who died in the Union prison there was ended by the Department of Veteran Affairs. In 1997, Maryland ordered a recall of the license plates issued to the Sons of the Confederate Veterans, which carried a tiny image of the battle flag. The SCV was the only one of 215 nonprofit organizations to have its plates rejected. At Antietam, a campaign is underway to prevent the erection, even on private property, of any statues to the Confederate commanders at that bloodiest of battles on American soil. Of 104 statues there now, only 4 honor Southerners. In Selma, the Alabama town defended by General Nathan Bedford Forrest, a statue to the Civil War legend has been repeatedly trashed. The city council wants it down. Memphis's city council has proposed turning the city's Confederate Memorial Park, which also features a statue of Forrest, into a memorial park for cancer victims. Forrest was the greatest cavalry commander America has ever produced. And though a slave trader before the war who embraced the Klan as a weapon in a savage fight for individual and sectional survival, Forrest thrust the Klan away soon after he saw that it injured, instead of aided, the best interests of the South and the nation. Following a lynching in 1874 in Trenton, Tennessee, General Forrest threatened to exterminate the killers. By 1875, he was urging that blacks be allowed entry into the practice of law and anywhere else they were capable of going. Even the great emancipator, another Southerner born in a log cabin, never said that. As columnist Walter Williams writes, Forrest always praised the bravery of the black soldiers who served in his command. These boys stayed with me, and better Confederates did not live. But America is not as big a country today as the America that paid homage to Bedford Forrest as a peerless fighting man. Gilmore surrenders Virginia's heritage ran the headline over the front page story in the Washington Times. Governor James S. Gilmore III, President Bush's choice as national chairman of the Republican Party, had just abolished Confederate History Month after the NAACP threatened a boycott of Virginia if the governor did not terminate the tradition. Virginia scraps tribute to Confederacy was the Washington Post page 1 headline. Striking at a core belief of the Confederate remembrance groups, wrote the Post reporter, Gilmore expanded the resolution to say for the first time that had there been no slavery, there would have been no war. Heritage groups argue that Lincoln's refusal to let South Carolina, Georgia, and the Gulf states depart in peace brought on the war. The Post story quoted only one critic of Gilmore and was heavily weighted with comments supporting an end to Confederate History Month. With this decision, the Post suggested, Gilmore's national career was now on an upward trajectory. Black leaders generally hailed Gilmore's revised proclamation as a positive step that could be a political boost to the white conservative Republican, who may have his eye on a Senate seat. Tony Michelle Travis, an African American who teaches government at George Mason University, said any aspirations for federal office that Gilmore may have could be bolstered by what she called his, the governor's, effort to reach out. Carry Me Back to Old Virginny is no longer Virginia's state song. It was removed because it contains the phrases Darky's Heart and Old Massa, though it was written in 1875 by the black composer James Bland, a New Yorker, who also wrote O Dem Golden Slippers. Book banning has begun. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, from which all modern American literature proceeds, as Hemingway said, has been removed from school reading lists across America. Twain's great satirical attack on slavery, hypocrisy, and prejudice in antebellum America has as its central black character the slave Jim, a man of great dignity and moral courage. But to black educator John Wallace, who has made a career attacking it, Huckleberry Finn is the most grotesque example of racist trash ever given our children to read. Any teacher caught trying to use that piece of trash with our children should be fired on the spot, for he or she is either racist, insensitive, naive, incompetent, or all of the above. Hemingway, T.S. Eliot, and Lionel Trilling thought Huckleberry Finn an American classic. But who are they to contradict John Wallace? Not far down the target list is Harper Lee's Pulitzer Prize-winning To Kill a Mockingbird, set in the segregated South before World War II, which inspired the film of the same name that gave Gregory Peck his finest role as the lawyer Atticus Finch. To those who detest the book, To Kill a Mockingbird represents institutionalized racism. Opelousas Catholic High in Louisiana has the distinction of being the first U.S. high school to ban the work of Flannery O'Connor, perhaps the finest Catholic fiction writer of 20th century America. Black parents and a black priest at Opelousas Catholic demanded that O'Connor's collection, A Good Man is Hard to Find, containing the short story The Artificial N-Word, be removed from school reading lists. But, as Catholic film critic and New York Post columnist Ron Dreher writes, O'Connor, by featuring white bigots as protagonists, exposes and condemns the hellish pride that leads these characters to dismiss black people as N-words, and he writes that Artificial N-Word, which O'Connor considered her best work, offers a psychologically penetrating portrait of racism. Bishop Edward O'Donnell initially fended off demands for O'Connor's purge from the curriculum by pointing out that her books were taught at Xavier, Grambling, Southern, and other black colleges. But His Eminence quickly capitulated and ordered that all O'Donnell books be removed from diocesan Catholic schools and that no similar books replace them. Any book containing racial epithets is forbidden, no matter the context, which would seem to rule out not only Twain, O'Connor, and Harper Lee, but William Faulkner and black authors Ralph Ellison and James Baldwin. Writes Dreher, essentially, O'Connor is not about race at all, which is why it is so refreshing, coming as it does out of such a racial culture. The black novelist Alice Walker once wrote about O'Connor, if it can be said to be about anything, then it is about prophets and prophecy, about revelation, and about the impact of supernatural grace on human beings who don't have a chance of spiritual growth without it. Prime stuff, you would think, for study in a Catholic high school in the Deep South, Dreher adds. Yes, you would think so. In 1999, Chief Justice William H. Rehnquist was admonished in a formal resolution by the National Bar Association for singing Dixie at the Judicial Conference of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. Rehnquist annually attends and leads the sing-along. Yet Dixie was ordered played by Lincoln himself when he visited the Confederate capital after Richmond had fallen to Grant's army. For generations after the Civil War, Dixie was as popular at Democratic Party conventions as Happy Days Are Here Again after FDR. Yet the National Bar Association insists that the song is a symbol of slavery and oppression. Here are the words. Let the reader be the judge. First verse. I wish I was in the land of cotton. Old times there are not forgotten. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. In Dixieland where I was bornin', early on a frosty mornin'. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. Chorus. Then I wish I was in Dixie. Hooray, hooray! In Dixieland I'll take my stand, to live and die in Dixie. Away, away, away down south in Dixie. Away, away, away down south in Dixie. Not as weighty as the cantos of Ezra Pound, but what does this little ditty have to do with slavery and oppression? In Gaslight Square in the St. Louis of the early 1960s, the Black Dixieland Jazz Band closed each nightly performance with a rendition of Dixie, followed by the Battle Hymn of the Republic. All mellowed patrons stood, sang, and cheered both. How insensitive we all were. By 1999, however, Justice Rehnquist was already a citizen under suspicion by the thought police for refusing to redesignate the Supreme Court's Christmas party as a holiday party. The singing Chief Justice apparently also insists on taking the lead in warbling the Christmas carols his colleagues had outlawed from America's public schools. Though the Cross of St. Andrew only flew over the Civil War battlefields for 4 years, the American flag flew for more than 4 generations over a country whose constitution countenanced slavery. It was thus inevitable that the turn of Old Glory would also come, and so it has. In the spring of 2001, Democratic Representative Henry Brooks of Memphis, former membership chairman of the NAACP's Political Action Committee, refused to stand in the Tennessee legislature during the Pledge of Allegiance. Said Brooks, "This flag represents the former colonies that enslaved our ancestors." While the NAACP did not respond to requests for comment on Brooks' defiance, columnist Julianne Malveaux did. "It is ridiculous," said Malveaux, "for African Americans to recite the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, for the words are nothing but a lie, just a lie." For some Americans, racial consciousness now conflicts with and supersedes national consciousness. But the war on the past is not unique to America. The new mayor of London, Red Ken Livingstone, wants to knock off their pedestals British generals whose names are associated with empire and rule of peoples of color. Among the statues the iconoclastic mayor wanted down are those of Admiral Sir Charles Napier, who conquered Zinde in 1843, and Sir Henry Havelock, who suppressed the Sepoy Mutiny in 1857. Napier is remembered for having sent back to his commanders the coded message Peccavi, Latin for I have sinned. But the most famous of those whom Red Ken no longer wants in his London is Major General Charles Chinese Gordon, who suppressed the Taiping Rebellion in China, helped end the slave trade, and died in Sudan when his small force suffered the fate of Custer's, fighting the dervishes of the Mahdi. Gordon's head was put on a pole and brought to the Mahdi's tent, to the immense consternation of Queen Victoria. 2 decades after the Battle of Khartoum, the British took their revenge at Omdurman, where 11,000 wildly charging dervishes were cut down by the rifles and Maxim guns of General Kitchener. Among those making history's final great cavalry charge was young Winston Churchill. The Anglo-Egyptian army lost 48 men, and Hilaire Belloc tipped his cap to British technology. Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not. Kitchener proceeded to desecrate the Mahdi's tomb, and thought of using his skull as an inkstand, so perhaps his statue should come down as well. In the 1966 film Khartoum, the Mahdi was played by Laurence Olivier, and General Gordon by Charlton Heston, currently of the National Rifle Association. Meanwhile, plans advanced to erect in Trafalgar Square, where Admiral Horatio Nelson's column stands, a 9-foot statue of Nelson Mandela. France also hosts the new iconoclasts. When the government tried to organize a 1996 celebration to mark the 1500th anniversary of the baptism of Clovis, King of the Franks, socialists, communists, and all the parties of the left, half of France, protested any commemoration of the year that France became Christian. What do these incidents tell us? That those who loudly preach diversity often do not practice it. That those who decry intolerance may be found among the most intolerant. Like the Taliban and the great Buddhas of Bamiyan, our cultural revolution intends to tear down all the flags and statues of the old America that it abhors, and it will hear no appeal. Whether a state chooses to honor Dr. King or Robert E. Lee should be a decision for its own people. No stigma should attach to any state that chooses to honor one, both, or neither. But that is unacceptable. Not to honor Dr. King today is intolerable. When Arizona voted not to have a holiday for King, the state was threatened with loss of the Super Bowl and convention boycotts, and berated by the national press. The pressure and abuse were so unbearable that the state overturned a popular vote and ratified the holiday. Only then was Arizona permitted to rejoin the Union. The Citadel in South Carolina, one of 2 U.S. colleges with an all-male cadet corps, a 150-year-old tradition, was the target of repeated and bankrupting court challenges to force the school to admit women. The Citadel wanted to keep its tradition. The women of the Citadel, wives, sisters, mothers, daughters of graduates, wanted to keep the tradition. So did South Carolina. But what people want no longer matters in America. A federal court ordered the Citadel to bring women into the Cadet Corps. In our Orwellian world of newspeak, diversity means conformity. In the name of diversity, every military school must look alike. None may be all male, even if that is what those to whom the school belongs desire. Is this freedom? Is this democracy? No. Orwell got it right. One makes the revolution to establish the dictatorship. The French and Russian and Maoist and Khmer Rouge and Taliban revolutions all dethroned the old gods and desecrated their temples. So it is with our cultural revolution. It cannot abide dissent. Only after Senator McCain apologized for not having denounced the Confederate battle flag over the South Carolina Capitol and confessed to opportunism and weakness was he restored to the good graces of the Revolution. The new history. Every child in America should be acquainted with his own country. As soon as he opens his lips, he should rehearse the history of his own country. He should lisp the praise of liberty, and of those illustrious heroes and statesmen who had wrought a revolution in her favor. So said Noah Webster. So we once believed. But the Cultural Revolution is purging the history of those illustrious heroes and statesmen from public schools to prepare a new curriculum, to separate children from parents and their beliefs, and to cut children off from their heritage. Said Solzhenitsyn, to destroy a people, you must first sever their roots. To create a new people, the agents of our cultural revolution must first create a new history, and that project is well advanced. In 1992, UCLA was awarded $2 million by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the U.S. Department of Education to develop new national history standards for the textbooks for children from the 5th through the 12th grades. In 1997, UCLA completed its assignment. In the history texts to be studied by American children in the public schools of the future, no mention was made of Samuel Adams, Paul Revere, Thomas Edison, Alexander Graham Bell, or the Wright brothers. There were 17 references to the Ku Klux Klan and 9 references to Senator Joseph R. McCarthy. Harriet Tubman was referenced 6 times, while Robert E. Lee was ignored. The founding dates of the Sierra Club and the National Organization for Women were recommended for special notice. Instructions for teaching students about the traitor Alger Hiss and executed Soviet spies Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who gave the atom bomb secrets to Stalin, urged leeway for teachers to teach it either way. The Constitutional Convention was never mentioned. The presidency of George Washington was unmentioned, as was his farewell address. Instead, students were invited to construct a dialogue between an Indian leader and George Washington at the end of the Revolutionary War. America's 1969 moon landing did not appear, but the Soviet Union was commended for its great advances in space exploration. The only congressional figure included was House Speaker Tip O'Neill, cited for calling President Reagan a cheerleader for selfishness. Teachers were urged to have their pupils conduct a mock trial of John D. Rockefeller of Standard Oil. Students were instructed to analyze the achievements of and grandeur of Mansa Musa's court and the social customs and wealth of the Kingdom of Mali, and to study Aztec skills, labor, system, and architecture. No mention of the quaint old Aztec custom of human sacrifice. Were the national history standards flushed down the toilet as Rush Limbaugh recommended? It would not appear so. In December 2000, the Washington Times reported on the new Virginia state standards for learning history. First graders will find Pocahontas gets equal time with Captain John Smith. In introducing younger children to the Civil War, teachers have dropped Lee and Stonewall Jackson. Third graders will study the highly developed West African kingdom of Mali, of our old friend Mansa Musa. A new emphasis is to be placed on Confucianism and Indus Valley civilization. Who and what were dropped to make room for Confucius? Paul Revere, Davy Crockett, Booker T. Washington, John Paul Jones, Thanksgiving, the Pilgrims, Independence Day, and Virginia statesman Harry F. Byrd, Sr. The war on America's past and the dumbing down of American children to make their minds empty vessels into which the new history may be poured is succeeding. In a recent student survey, 556 seniors from 55 of the nation's top-ranked colleges and universities were asked 34 questions from a high school course on U.S. history. 4 out of 5 flunked. Only 1/3 of this college seniors could name the American general at Yorktown. Only 23% named Madison as the principal author of the Constitution. Only 22% linked the words government of the people, by the people, and for the people to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. The good news, 98% knew rapper Snoop Doggy Dogg, and 99% identified Beavis and Butthead. We cannot escape history, said Lincoln, but thanks to our cultural revolution, the Gen Xers may have just done it. 10 years ago, Jesse Jackson led a Philistine parade across the Palo Alto campus of Stanford, chanting, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, Western culture's gotta go." Faced with so convincing an argument, Stanford replaced its required course in Western civilization with a new one, Culture, Ideas, and Values. Today, not one of the 55 elite colleges and universities, as ranked by U.S. News and World Report, requires a course in American history to graduate. The debate about curriculum, writes Dr. Schlesinger, is a debate about what it means to be an American. What is ultimately at stake is the American future. But what will America's future be when it is decided by a generation oblivious to American history and suffering from cultural Alzheimer's? About the time the UCLA standards became public, the Smithsonian Institute held its 15th anniversary exhibit of VJ Day. That exhibit, which featured the cockpit of the B-29 that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, the Enola Gay, had ignited an explosion of veterans and public wrath for its portrayal of America's war in the Pacific as racist. Columnist John Leo of U.S. News took the occasion to visit other museums on the mall that teach tourists and school children about America's past. At the Museum of American History, Leo found the Science in American Life exhibit to be a disparaging, politically loaded look at American science, concentrating single-mindedly only on failures and dangers. DDT, 3 Mile Island, the ozone hole, acid rain, the explosion of the Challenger, Love Canal. At the Air and Space Museum, he found the airplane indicted as an invention whose primary use has been for mass slaughter. In future scripts, however, Leo found that Japanese kamikaze pilots, whose suicide crashes took a terrible toll on U.S. Navy ships and American sailors, would be painted as heroes of the air. The children of Gramsci had captured the museums of America. Almost alone, novelist Tom Wolfe noted the astonishing absence of any celebration of the first American century at its close on December 31st, 1999, the eve of the millennium. Where was I? On the wrong page? The wrong channel? Outside the bandwidth? Did a single solitary savant note that the first American century had just come to an end and the second American century had begun? Was a single bard bestirred to write a mighty anthem along the lines of James Thomas's "Rule, Britannia, Britannia rule the waves, Britons never shall be slaves for America"? The nation that in the century just concluded had vanquished two barbaric nationalist brotherhoods, the German Nazis and the Russian Communists, two hordes of methodical slave-hunting predators who made the Huns and Magyars look whimsical by comparison. Did any of the America at Century's End network TV specials strike the exuberant note that Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee struck in 1897? My impression was that one American century rolled into another with all the pomp and circumstance of a mousepad. America's great triumph inspired all the patriotism and pride, all of the yearning for glory and empire, all of the martial jubilee music of a mouse click. Who looked back in pride at all America had accomplished in the century just ended? In all the celebrations from London to New York, to Tokyo to Beijing, who looked back to the man whose 2000th birthday it was? Almost none, for by the coming of the new millennium, Americans were living in a civilization, culture, and country that, in its public life, was well along the way to de-Christianization.